Пані та панове, шановні глядачі, ladies and gentlemen, dear viewers, my name is Danil Lubkivsky and I address you from Kyiv. The Kyiv Security Forum continues its special online meetings called Fight for Ukraine. It's the 74th day of Russia's genocidal war against our nation. This day, the 8th of May, we mark Victory Day over Nazism in the Second World War. Ukraine's sufferings and losses during the war of 1939-45 were enormous. Some 5 to 7 million people perished. More than 700 cities and towns and 28,000 villages had been destroyed. But we won that war. The fight was won by many United Nations, including Ukrainians. Today, our nations are united again in the heroic struggle against a new type of Nazism, the Russian imperialism aimed at eliminating Ukraine and changing the world order. Like the Nazis in 1939, Russia says it wants to ensure the final solution to the Ukrainian question. Time and again, we fight together against inhumanity and tyranny. Today I spoke with my friends on the front. They have only one call. We will win, but do not hesitate with weapons. Give us weapons to protect Ukraine. Give us more and quickly. That's what we desperately need for the Ukrainian victory. Why the Ukrainian victory is important to the world? Why should the united democracies defend themselves against new tyranny? What difference can our common victory make for the international order? These questions we will discuss today with our most distinguished guests. And I wish to introduce our speakers. First of all, Anne Applebaum, author and historian, Pulitzer-prize winner of 2004. I thank you, Anne, for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Ambassador Michael Carpenter, the United States Permanent Representative to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Thank you, Mike, for being with us tonight.
Good to be with you, Daniel.
Carl Bildt, Prime Minister of Sweden in 1991-94 and former Foreign Minister of Sweden. Thank you, Prime Minister, for being with us.
Pleasure to be with you.
And Arseniy Yatsenyuk, former Prime Minister of Ukraine and today's chairman of the Kyiv Security Forum. Thank you, Arseniy, for being with us.
Thank you, Dan.
Tonight, we will also present the special video address recorded for the Kyiv Security Forum and addressed to Ukraine by Timothy Snyder, author and historian, the Levin Professor of History at Yale University. And I invite Arseniy Yatsenyuk to make his introductory remarks. You're welcome, Mr. Yatsenyuk.
Well, distinguished panel and distinguished audience, today we commemorate the end of the Second World War. Today we mourn and pray. Tomorrow, Mr. Putin, I don't want to call him a President Putin, but Mr. Putin, he will celebrate, not commemorate. Tomorrow, he is to make fireworks and claps and applauses, not praise and mourns. We are commemorating the liberation of Europe from Nazis regime. But those who decided to make a kind of celebration tomorrow, they launched and waged a new war, completely the same that Hitler did, against sovereign, independent Ukraine. I never imagined that in my lifetime, I am to be a witness of Ukraine is under outrageous, brutal, and brazen attack committed by the Russian army, Russian president, and Russian people. I was born in Ukraine, in Soviet Ukraine. And even during Soviet times, they always said that, look, this will never happen again. But Mr. Putin, he is the follower. He is the follower of Hitler and those who present Nazi regime. Ukrainian people are suffering. Ukrainian people are in a very dire strait, but we are fighting like hell. Ukrainian military is so courageous and strong that this military deterred and even launched a counter-offensive against one of the biggest army in the universe, which is the Russian army. We are fighting for our homeland. We are fighting for our families. We are fighting for our lives. We are fighting for our future. We will prevail. And my appeal to the entire world is that, look, there is no other option rather than to win for Ukraine, because Ukrainian victory is the victory of the entire free world. This is the fight for Ukraine. This is the fight for the human rights. This is the fight for freedom. This is the fight for independence. This is the righteous fight. So I urge everyone in the world to help Ukraine, to save Ukraine, to support the Ukrainian people. We are on the right side of the history, all of us. And I do commend the United States administration, American people, the G7, the European Union, everyone who realized that Putin and his regime is the real threat to our lives, to our families, to our countries, and to our security. I am confident that in this war, Ukraine is to win. And I am confident that we will show to everyone in this world that democracy and freedom will always prevail.
I thank you. The Kyiv Security Forum is proud to present the special video address by Timothy Snyder, the Levin professor at Yale University.
A Ukrainian victory. We're all thinking about victory, or at least the end of the war, as we get into May. What I'm about to speak to you about is the significance of this war and how this war might end, or how this war must end. I'd like to give you 10 reasons why we ought to be thinking in terms of Ukrainian victory. I'd like to give you 10 reasons why the Ukrainian victory is important, not just for Ukraine, but for the larger world. The first, and perhaps the most fundamental, is that a Ukrainian victory is, I believe, the only way to achieve peace. Presumably, all sane people would like for this war to come to an end. I believe that a victory by Ukraine is the only way in which this war can come to an end. A Russian victory will lead to further Russian aggression. A Ukrainian capitulation will lead to the continuation of policies of atrocity on Ukrainian soil. The one way I believe that this war can actually end is with a Ukrainian victory, that is, with sufficient Ukrainian success on the field of battle that Russia believes that it's in its interest to negotiate. Secondly, I believe the Ukrainian victory is important for the security of the region. The only way that the Ukrainian population could be protected is by way of Ukrainian victory. But I believe it's also very significant for the populations of the Baltic countries, of Poland, Romania, Moldova, that Russian aggression against a neighboring country not succeed. The third reason I believe that Ukrainian victory is important has to do, above all, with the citizens of Ukraine. There is no other way to protect the citizens of Ukraine, I believe, than by Ukrainian victory. So long as the war continues, Ukrainian citizens under Russian occupation are subject to deportation and other forms of atrocity. Ukrainians not under Russian occupation are vulnerable to bombing and shelling. The only way to secure the 40 million Ukrainians is for the war to cease, and the only way for the war to cease is by way of a Ukrainian victory. The fourth reason extremely important, I believe, has to do with the defense of a democracy. One reason this war is being fought is that Ukraine is a democracy. Ukraine has that kind of unpredictable political system, which throws up unpredictable combinations, unpredictable leaders. It's that unpredictability, it's that inability to know what's going to come next that I think is so intolerable for Mr. Putin and for this kind of Russian regime. So one reason why it's important for Ukraine to win this war is for a democracy to protect itself. But I believe, and this is my next point, number 5, that this is important for democracies as such. Were Russia to win this war, that would be a tremendous victory for all forces that oppose democracy, for all people who are planning to use violence of one kind or another to overthrow democracies. If Ukraine wins, that is a victory for those who believe in law, who wish to hold elections, who wish to hold their leaders accountable, and especially for those who are willing to take risks for all those important things. Relatedly, and this is reason number 6, a victory by Ukraine is also a victory by a state which has traditionally been seen as peripheral, which has traditionally been seen as colonial, against a power which would like to see itself as central and as imperial. Imperial wars, as we know, especially from the history of the 19th and 20th century, belong to a certain phase of political development. Imperial wars will continue so long as imperial powers believe that they can win them. Every European power and plenty of other powers reach a point where they realize that they will be exhausted by imperial war, and that is, frankly, a very good thing, a good thing for everyone concerned. So because this is an imperial war, a war in which Russian leadership claims that there's no Ukrainian people, there's no Ukrainian state, a victory by Ukraine is important to defend the basic principle that nations are equal and states deserve respect. In other words, a victory by Ukraine is one more push towards a post-imperial world. Speaking of a post-imperial world, my 7th reason for believing the Ukrainian victory is important has to do with the recollection of the Second World War. In Mr. Putin's telling, the lesson of the Second World War is that we need more war. In Mr. Putin's telling, the lesson of the defeat of fascism is that we need more fascism. In Mr. Putin's telling, the lesson of the defeat of imperialism is that we need more imperialism. In Mr. Putin's telling, the lesson of the Second World War is that the word Nazi just means whatever he wants it to mean and can be deployed as hate speech against whoever happens to be his enemy of choice. That is one reading of the Second World War. It's not a reading of the Second World War which should prevail. I think it's very important, as this war is being fought, to consider it, as so many people are doing, in the light of the Second World War, but in particular to consider it as an opportunity to preserve certain virtues which many of us believed were reinforced by that war, or should have been reinforced by that war. Toleration for difference, for example. The importance of the rule of law and pluralism, for example. The importance of cooperation among democracies, for example. Number 8, I believe that Ukrainian victory is also very important for the future of Russia. Now, to be very clear, I don't expect Ukrainians to be thinking about this factor, but for the rest of us who are concerned about the security of Europe and security of the world, it's very important what kind of Russia we'll be living alongside in decades to come. For Russia to become, let's call it, a normal country where Russian interests are observed by Russian leaders, it's very important that Russia lose this war. It's very important that Russians cease to pursue a foreign policy which is about gathering in land on the basis of entirely untenable myths. I believe it's very important for Russia, for Russians, and for future Russian governments to be in a position to think instead about the future of Russia and about the reality of Russian interests. And I think a defeat on the battlefield here, although I wish there weren't battlefields, I wish there weren't a war, I believe that defeat on the battlefield here will be a step forward towards that kind of Russia, a Russia where Russians are able to think about a future away from imperialism, a Russia where the past perhaps weighs a bit less heavily as myth on the decisions of the present, and a Russia where interests can be considered and the future can be considered. Number 9, Ukraine must win this war because Ukraine, as everyone knows, is a major source of food for the rest of the world. In the history of the 20th century, Ukraine has been an object of colonization from all sides because of its fertile soil. In the present war, we observe as Russia illegally expropriates Ukrainian agricultural products, and we watch as Russia illegally blockades the rest of the world from Ukrainian agricultural exports. Should this war continue in this way, people in Africa, in the Near East, and elsewhere are going to be threatened with anticipated and then real food shortages, which will have the consequence not only, I believe, of hunger and death, but also of political instability along the way. A Ukrainian victory and a reopening of world trade would prevent all of that. 10th, finally, last but not least, and in some ways summing up all of these other points, a Ukrainian victory is necessary to help point not just Ukrainians, but all the rest of us towards the future. In a way, the problem of Russian propaganda is a problem that we all share, perhaps in less sharp form. Russian propaganda is all about the past. It's all about how things are predetermined. It's all about seeking some kind of moment at some point in history where we were right and everyone else was wrong. But that's not what we need. We, everyone, needs a future. We need a politics of the future. We need an event that can break us out of our rut and which can point us towards a future. I believe it's very important that Europeans and others help to offer Ukrainians a future after this war in the form of membership in the European Union and in the form of generous aid which allows Ukrainians to rebuild. But I think the process goes two ways. I think if we are open-minded and generous about the way we look at Ukraine, about how we look at this war, we can see that Ukrainians are also offering a future to us. Had Ukrainians not fought, had Ukrainians capitulated, our future, the future of democracies, would look very bleak right now. Because Ukrainians did resist, and because Ukrainians are fighting, they bought other democracies a certain amount of time. I think this time should be used to think about the future, not just a future in which Ukraine joins other democracies in important forms of cooperation, but also a future in a broader sense, where a Ukrainian victory demonstrates that individual action matters, that people can take responsibility, that the range of possibilities is broader than we think, that there are things that can happen in the future that are perhaps better than we think. Ukraine or Ukrainian victory also points us in this direction. Thank you very much for your attention.
And we thank Dr. Snyder for his great remarks. And now I turn to Anne Applebaum. Anne, more than a month ago, you wrote in your article in Atlantic that the Ukrainians and the democratic powers that support Ukraine must work toward a goal. That goal should be a Ukrainian victory. 100%. I fully endorse what you wrote. Why, in your opinion, is the Ukrainian victory important to the world? You're welcome.
Thank you so much for the question. Thanks for inviting me and for organizing this event. I think it should be clear, first of all, when I wrote the article and why. You know, when this war began, I was here in Washington, and there was a strong feeling among many people who know the region well, particularly specialists in the Russian military and in Russian politics, that the war would be over quickly. I was even told by quite well-established Washington figure, an expert on Russia, that there was no reason to arm Ukraine because the war would be over so quickly that it wouldn't help. I argued otherwise, others argued otherwise, but still, it was almost as if this city was kind of frozen in motion for a few days and really for the first week of the war, waiting to see what happened. When it became clear that the Ukrainians were not going to give up, that Zelensky was not going to escape Kyiv, in particular when he made that extraordinary video of himself and his colleagues standing in front of the presidential palace, the mood in Washington began to change. And over the next few weeks, you all saw there were deliveries of tactical weapons, javelins, stingers, equipment that you could help the Ukrainians push back, particularly in the area around Kyiv. But there was a moment still of doubt when people in the United States, in the White House, in the Pentagon, were still asking, well, what happens next? Do we just continue this support at this kind of level, or do we try for something else? And this is the moment when I felt and others felt that it was very important to argue for victory, because it was really only by trying to conceive and think about what it would mean for Ukraine to win that we could help them win. And once we had that idea, then it would become clear to us, or at least more clear, what our policy should be. And I should say, first of all, that I think there was such a shift. You saw it in the last 2 or 3 weeks when the level and nature of American help for Ukraine and for the Ukrainian military began to change. The type of weapons that are much more sophisticated, the training that's being done for Ukrainians outside of Ukraine for soldiers and officers, I think represents that shift. And what the shift represented was an understanding of why the victory of Ukraine is important, not only for Ukraine, but for all of us. And by all of us, I mean us in Washington, us in Berlin, in Warsaw, in Stockholm, in Paris. What the Ukrainians did, notably Zelensky, but also many others, in defending their country and in explaining so eloquently why they were defending it, is that it reminded many of those who live in Western capitals and all over the West, I should say, what's the meaning of democracy and of sovereignty and why they are so important. For a very long time in Western Europe and the United States, we've had this kind of culture war, between people who think on the one hand that liberal values are important and on the other hand that nationalism or patriotism are important. And it felt like those were two different strands of thinking. And what Zelensky's eloquent speeches did, what the actions and speech of so many other Ukrainians did, was prove that you can have both, that you can have a patriotic, unified, even nationalist defense of liberal values. And not just liberal values, but a kind of civic patriotism. What Ukraine has come to represent is not an ethnic nationalism, not a sort of narrow, particular form of national identity, but something broader. Ukraine is a country where people can speak both Ukrainian and Russian, where people of different nationalities and different religions can live and work together, where the president can be Jewish, where other members of the cabinet and leadership can have other faiths and religions, where it's possible to work together based not on ethnic identity, but on a broader idea of what society means, what democracy is, what the rule of law means. And once Ukraine began to symbolize that, then the importance of defending Ukraine became a lot clearer to Americans, and the way to defend Ukraine also became clear. I'm not going to repeat what Tim Snyder has said. I agree with much of what he says and have written some of it elsewhere. I would just stress this fact that because Ukraine successfully argued that what it stood for were universal values, values respected all across the Western world, the European world, I should say the democratic world, because West is a geographic notation, and really we're talking about values that apply also in Asia and South America and many other places. Once he was able to do that, then it became clear that victory was needed. And then from then, as I say, once the goal was clear, then the strategy followed. A few words about that goal. It's pretty clear in Washington now that the goal is not just, that victory means, I should say, Ukrainian sovereignty, a Ukraine that decides what its borders will be, and a Ukraine that is safe from further Russian invasion. What that means is yet to be decided. I hope that this will become increasingly the topic of conversation, again, all across the democratic world in the next few weeks. What will be the nature of the security guarantees or the treaties or the pacts that will be made with Ukraine after the war ends? But thinking about that is also very important now. The war is not won yet, it is not over, but beginning to conceive of what a safe, independent, sovereign Ukraine would look like will also help determine what the tactics and strategy are from now on.
Thank you, Anne. In the opinion of the Kyiv Security Forum, and I believe that our audience will share what I am going to say, that only NATO's membership could be for an effective security guarantee for our independence, and we look forward to that goal. But nevertheless, we talk about Ukraine, and Ukraine is a true democracy, you say. Now let's talk about true imperialism, which is Russia. Russia has positioned itself as one of the biggest challenges to the international order. Not only Putin is guilty of that, it's a shared responsibility of the Russian political and cultural elite, society and people. It's inseparable. Is it possible, in your opinion, to cure Russia's deep ideological and cultural diseases? I mean, Timothy said that they have to have the future a way of imperialism. Is it really possible with Russia? What to do with Russia? This question sounds like one of the most important and difficult questions of the 21st century. Your opinion, you're welcome.
First of all, Russia is not condemned either by history or by genetics or anything else to be the way it is. No country is condemned. There is no such thing as determinism. Countries do change. They become different. I think Ukraine is a good example of a country that has changed a lot in the last 30 years. How and why they change depends on many factors, most notably leadership, but not only. And I preserve the idea that Russia could change. One of the elements of that change is going to be encouragement of the existence of a different Russia. We all know that it exists. We know that there is a Russian media and intellectual and business class that has left the country since February the 24th. Actually, tens of thousands of people. Some of them are in Europe, some of them are in America, many of them are in places like Istanbul and Yerevan and Tbilisi. And encouraging that class to continue to exist, making sure that it has a voice, making sure that it has access to satellite television, perhaps even making sure that it has its own university, its own newspapers, its own place to cultivate an alternate Russia is really important. I agree with you that the fault of this, the tragedy of this war is not just Putin's tragedy. It's the tragedy of the Russian elite and a part of the cultural elite. We all know the names of the composers and artists and others who have supported Putin's war. But I want to maintain that there is another part of the elite that does not support the war, and we have to hope that they have a leading role in determining what happens in Russia in the future. And so, if you're asking me about policy, then the policy should be there. The policy should be about seeking to reach Russians, and I know that a lot of Ukrainians have thought and are thinking in creative ways about how to do that, how to reach Russians inside Russia, but also how to reach Russians outside of Russia, to make sure that Russians and Russian speakers, everywhere from Ukraine to Moldova to Germany to Kazakhstan, to make sure that they also know there's a different Russia available. There's a different way of thinking. There's a different way of being Russian. And I know that such people exist. I've met them. I've talked to them. I talked to one or two of them even this morning. And my hope is that they will be able to lead the country in the future. How and why the change in Russian leadership will happen is not something that I can predict. As you know, one of the strange things about modern Russia is that not only can we not say who would be the next leader after Putin, we can't say who would decide that. So there's no Soviet Communist Party, there's no Politburo, there are no intermediate institutions that have the ability to change the leadership or to choose a new leader. So we are all really, we're operating in the dark. I have simply no way to tell you how any change would happen or how a leadership change would come about. But it will have to happen. Eventually there will be a change, and preparing Russia and hoping that Russians who don't believe in the empire, Russians who have a belief and an interest in the future, and Russians who have an interest in Russia, in cultivating the prosperity and happiness of Russians and not merely the wealth and prestige of the elite, hoping that kind of leadership wins next time and helping that kind of leadership to win in any way we can. I think this is a task for all of us, including Ukrainians.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you very much for these thoughts about Ukraine, about Russia, about our common struggle. And I would like to express our gratitude for everything you do for Ukraine and for our common case. I do appreciate it. And thank you very much for your time and being with us. And now I turn to Ambassador Michael Carpenter, our good friend and great friend and true friend of Ukraine. Michael, thank you for joining this discussion. And let me immediately start from my appreciation of your mission in Vienna, being the permanent representative of the United States to the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Look, Anne says that there is no natural liberal world order and there are no rules without someone to enforce them. Unless democracies defend themselves together, the forces of autocracy will destroy them. I remember you wrote together with Joe Biden an article in Foreign Affairs stating this point of view. Please tell us, why do you think is the Ukrainian victory important to the world, to the United Nations, to the OSCE, and to many other international actors? You're welcome.
Thanks, Danilo. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be with you. The way I look at it, there's sort of three levels at which it is critical that Ukraine win. The first level is at the level of the international system, which is what you've just spoken about. If we live in a world where one country can use missiles and rockets and tanks to violate the borders of another, to undermine sovereignty and territorial integrity at the whim of one leader, then we're going to be living in that world permanently. That's not a world that anybody wants to live in. That is a world that upends all the fundamental principles of the international order as we've known them. And so if the Russian Federation is allowed to, quote, get away with this invasion of Ukraine, then we're in an entirely different world, which harkens back to a very dark and bygone time. Secondly, and Anne just spoke about this, and Tim Snyder did as well, this is a conflict between democracy and dictatorship. And the last time I was with Kyiv Security Forum, we spoke about this, how the tectonic plate between liberal democracies and authoritarian oligarchies runs right through the heart of Ukraine. And that is why we're seeing this war, because Mr. Putin does not want democracy on his border. And so he is trying to impose his particular form of corrupt tyranny on Ukraine. And Ukraine is a democracy. It is one that has been flawed since its independence in 91, but it is a democracy. And so it is important for democracy as well to triumph. And then third, I would also situate this at the individual level, at the level of sort of individual human dignity. Look, we've all seen these horrific images from Bucha and Borodyanka and other places where forces are engaging in the point-blank execution of civilians, mass rapes, looting, plunder. It's just barbaric behavior at the individual level. Ukrainians didn't do anything to deserve this. Peaceful citizens living in their country, waking up one day, one morning, with these marauding forces coming in and perpetrating these acts of just monstrous atrocities. And so at that level too, just human dignity requires that Ukraine prevail.
I thank you, Mike. In Ukraine's east and south, as you perfectly know, we clearly see that Russia uses the same practices as they did during the Holodomor genocide in the last century. They deliberately murder Ukrainians, they kill innocent civilians, they steal large amounts of grain, they destroy the infrastructure, and they simply lead Ukraine to a humanitarian catastrophe. Does the OSCE, does the Organization of Security for Security and Cooperation in Europe realize that this is a genocide?
Well, what I would tell you, Danilo, is that I don't represent the OSCE, nor do I speak for the OSCE. I represent the United States of America. And you've heard what President Biden has said on this topic, and I agree with him. What we have seen at the OSCE is the invocation of this mechanism, which dates back to the early 90s, which has allowed for a fact-finding team to go out and try to ascertain whether war crimes and crimes against humanity were committed in Ukraine. And they only looked at the first few weeks of the war. So we hope that there's a second invocation of this mechanism. But what they found very clearly was that war crimes were committed. And they came a hair's breadth from declaring that crimes against humanity had been committed. And the bar there is systematic abuses. And so I think as this war goes on, that bar is likely to be met. But what we've seen is, you're right, I mean, what we've seen is an attempt to erase Ukrainian identity. We see it now in Donetsk and Luhansk and Kherson, where the Russian ruble is being forced on the local population. The names of towns are being changed by the Russian occupying forces. The Russian curriculum is being instituted in schools. And a host of other decisions are being made together with these this horrid institution of filtration camps, something that we never thought we would be talking about in the year 2022, where the population of these regions is being sent against their will across the border. And so, you know, all of this points to the attempt by the Russian Federation to erase Ukrainian identity.
Right. Tomorrow, Vladimir Putin is going to address Russia from the Red Square. Some sources say that he might even officially declare, as they pretend they do not officially declare, a war against Ukraine, or anything of this kind, some kind of public, yet another public threat. What do you expect to hear? And how do you see Russia's future?
Well, Daniil, I frankly don't know what I expect to hear. I don't try to put myself in Vladimir Putin's head. But here's the reality of the situation. He has miscalculated terribly in launching this war. Russia clearly lost the Battle of Kyiv. Russian forces were driven out of the northern reaches of Kyiv and sent packing across the border. Now, of course, they're refitting, regrouping, and reattacking in the south and east. But they have committed such atrocities along the way. They have been so isolated in the international community. The sanctions, and probably even more importantly, the export controls that the entire Western world, and by that I mean our G7 partners, so not just the geographic West, but as Anne has pointed out, Japan, Singapore, New Zealand, Australia, etc., have imposed crippling sanctions and export controls that will deny Russia's economy the space to grow. And it is very difficult to see how President Putin pulls a victory out of the current situation. I mean, he has already made the hugest mistakes that he could possibly have ever dreamt of in the past. And so I do believe that Ukraine will succeed. And I think that regardless of what he says, it's likely to be lies and disinformation. Ukraine will ultimately triumph. And his vision of an imperial world in which the whims of one man dictate the international rules of the road will not succeed. He will fail in this quest.
Thank you, Mike. I use the opportunity to thank the United States administration and to thank you for your support of Ukraine. That's what I said at the very beginning of our discussion. I talked today with my friends, my very close friends who are on the front right now. And their call is only just one single word: weapons. This is what we need. And I hope that, I'm confident we will win. Thank you, Mike. Thank you for being with us. And now I turn to Carl Bildt, good friend of Ukraine again, and good friend of Kyiv Security Forum. Thank you very much, Carl, for your time and for joining this conversation. We talk about the Ukrainian victory, but in your opinion, how will Russia's defeat change the balance of powers globally? What will it mean not only for the West, but for China, India, and the East? You're welcome, sir.
Well, it clearly would, and it clearly would in a fairly profound way. But before answering that, let's just one remark on the days that we are celebrating. Today, in most of Europe, we celebrate the end of the Second World War because that was when capitulation actually happened. Tomorrow is important, but tomorrow is Europe Day, celebrated all over democratic Europe. And it's important to make the distinctions between the celebrations that will be happening in Moscow and what you will see throughout the European Union and other European democracies. The victory in World War II was fundamental. It ought to be celebrated. But what is celebrated on Europe Day is more than that. It is the ambition to build a Europe whole and free, of democracies building peace together by cooperating freely, voluntarily, building their own future and aiming to build that future in peace and freedom and democracy. It's a forward-looking, it's an optimistic vision. It's something geared for the future. It is not only celebrating the victories of the past, however important that is. And that being said, of course, what Mr. Putin stands for is contrary to everything that we will be celebrating on Europe Day tomorrow. Totally contrary. Mr. Putin is rather interesting, to put it in those terms, in the sense that he's very explicit on his aims. And if you read to his different speeches and interviews and whatever it is, he's been extremely clear in what he's trying to do. He launched this war in the same way as Hitler launched it in September of 1939 against Poland, in exactly the same way. It's an unprovoked, it's an all-out war with the same aim. Hitler did not want to see Poland exist. He wanted to take Poland off the map of Europe. And Mr. Putin, he doesn't beat around the bush. He makes very clear he wants to get rid of Ukraine. It was a historical mistake. It was even a crime committed by all sorts of people from Lenin and onwards. And it should be taken off the map. The same aim as Hitler had in 1939 is the aim that Mr. Putin has openly declared when he launched this brutal and aggressive war against Ukraine. He must lose. And the reasons are fairly obvious, and Tim Snyder and Mike have elaborated, and I can only agree with everything that's said. For an X numbers of reasons. I mean, democracy, the future of Ukraine and whatever, but also fundamentally aggression must not be tolerated. If we go back to the Second World War again, what happened after the capitulation, total capitulation of Germany, was the war crimes tribunals of Nuremberg and Tokyo. And what they did in their deliberations was to establish what they called the supreme crime, the supreme international crime. And the supreme international crime was aggression. You don't start war against other people. And that was the crime for which they committed the leaders of Germany and the leaders of Tokyo to death. And that has since been the supreme crime under international law. Were we to tolerate aggression, the consequences, and Mike alluded to that, would be momentous, because that would open the door to others to commit aggression. And there are certainly candidates around the world that would be tempted to use that. So winning this particular war is important primarily, of course, for Ukraine. Many of us have come to sort of love and like and appreciate and all of that, your country during the years that have passed, not only easy, but also in its difficulties. So it's primarily for Ukraine. It is for Europe, but it is also for the global order. If we accept a global order where powers, great or small, can conduct aggression against others, that would not be an order. That would be a global disorder that could unleash wars all over the place to the detriment of everyone. So It's a far bigger fight in that particular respect. By that, I forgot your question. What was it? Haha.
Carl, my question was about how that what kind of impact will Russia's defeat have on China, India, and the East?
No, obviously, the primary impact will be on, apart from Ukraine, that's fairly obvious. The primary impact, of course, be on Russia. And you could even question, and I think that's a question Mr. Putin puts to himself, can Russia survive a defeat? We should not forget that Russia is a country that during the last century collapsed twice. That's fairly unique. It collapsed in 1917, it collapsed in 1991, or however, whichever date you would put on that particular one. And that was when they had sort of overextended themselves in both cases. They didn't answer the demands of their populations. There were strains inside the regimes. They were disunited. They didn't have a political system that could cope with changes. And Russia did, in fact, collapse. I think the strains that are going to be on Russia resulting from losing this particular war, however you define it, are going to be such that the very existence of a regime is going to be put in question. And I think Russia is likely to enter a new time of troubles, as it had before in its history, when different interests are competing for power and competing for where they want Russia to go. That's not a very comfortable situation for neither Ukraine nor the rest of Europe. We want a stable, peaceful Russia. Russia that descends into sort of chaos and troubles and whatever might be less of an immediate threat, but certainly not what we wish for. As for the consequences for the rest of the world, of course, I mean, Russia has been, Mr. Putin in particular, he likes to make videos with launching ICBMs or different weapons. I mean, the prestige of Russian arms is very important for the prestige of Russia in the Putin version of Russia. And if Russian arms can't succeed, the impact of that on the prestige of Russia is going to be fairly fundamental. You can already see the Chinese starting to hedge their bets. I was in Delhi last week, and you can see the sand shifting in the perceptions of Russia there as well. But primarily, losing for Mr. Putin would be losing for the regime and would be a very different future for Russia.
And here, Carl, we come very close to one of the most dangerous questions that many people all over the globe, and especially in Ukraine, ask every day. You've been working with the Russians for many years, since the very beginning of the peace process in the Balkans, and you know almost everyone, or knew almost everyone in the Russian diplomatic service, I mean the leadership and so on. So you know the portrait, you know the psychology of that, like you understand what might happen and so on, to some extent, nevertheless. But right now, as they come very close to this dangerous, fatal line, what do you think? Can they cross a nuclear line if they understand that they are defeated? You're welcome.
They could. I don't think it's imminent. I don't think it's necessarily likely, but I wouldn't say it's entirely excluded. If they consider that the regime is under fundamental threat by outside powers and nuclear weapons could make a difference, they would use it. But I don't think that we will enter, with due respect to Ukraine, Ukraine winning will not mean Ukraine capturing Moscow. And the threat to the regime that could come is more going to be an internal threat in Russia. It's going to be different centers competing for power, different sort of social and economic discontent. Remember, not October, but February 1917. I mean, it's that sort of scenario. I don't say that is imminent. I don't think it is the number one scenario. But things have been happening in Russia before in a way that is fairly unique if we look at major powers. And that's got to be. Then the nuclear component is important. I mean, they have a hell of a lot of nuclear weapons. And that is dangerous. And you can see that is already having an effect. The fact that Mr. Biden President Biden, I'm not criticizing it, I'm noting it, is very clear to say that we don't want to go to war with Russia. United States has not been hesitant to go to war with others. Has of course everything to do with the fact that he has nuclear weapons. And the nuclear weapons question will be a fairly fundamental one if we arrive at the position of a regime crisis or even a regime collapse in Russia, which is something that I think most of us would have considered inconceivable 6 months ago, but I think it's moved into a somewhat different category since then.
I see. And finally, my last question. President Putin started his cynical, unprovoked war against Ukraine, claiming that he didn't want to have a border with NATO, larger than Russia had. But right now, Finland said that it considers an option of joining NATO. Then Sweden said that Sweden is going to join the alliance. So how do you see the future of this European security architecture if for even the president of Germany says that the idea of having some kind of common security with Russia is almost impossible? I mean, the idea failed, he said, has failed. So how do you see this European security, and how do you see Ukraine's place in that European Euro-Atlantic security architecture? You're welcome.
Very good question. I think that you will see within the next 10 days, you will see both Finland and Sweden officially declaring their intention to join NATO. That is certainly not something that Mr. Putin desired, but he can do very little about it. And it's clear consequences of his actions. You will see all of those nations, be that Germany or be that Denmark or be that Sweden, increasing defense spending quite substantially. Because we simply see that in a Europe where Mr. Putin sits in the Kremlin and is able to use military power in a way that I think a lot of Russians even considered inconceivable before February 24th, is a Europe where we have to move very much closer together. I think we'll see a stronger NATO, stronger as a military alliance for territorial defense of Europe. I think we'll see a stronger European Union as a security alliance, a stronger link between that military alliance and that security alliance, and a stronger link across the Atlantic. And then the big task would be, of course, to help Ukraine. Not only the rebuilding, I mean, the rebuilding of the physical infrastructure is expensive but comparatively easy, but rebuilding what I call the Ukraine 2.0, compatible with membership of the European Union, which is a very demanding thing. It doesn't come easily. But the Ukraine 2.0, that then must also be secured against Russia, because a secured, reformed, democratic Ukraine must then be very high up on the European agenda, because such a Ukraine will be fundamental to realizing that, to go back to what I said in the beginning, to that vision that we have of a Europe whole and free, democratic and dynamic, that most of us across Europe will be celebrating on Europe Day tomorrow.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Carl, for your great remarks. And I would like to thank you all for your contribution today, for your participation, and for your remarks at our conversation of the Kyiv Security Forum. We highly
Neil,
appreciate...
let me tell you one thing.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I would like to draw the attention of everyone to what is happening in Mariupol. You are well aware that those who are fighting for Ukrainian independence in Mariupol, this is the last stronghold and actually the last holdout of Ukrainian military in Azovstal steel plant. They need the support of Ukrainian government. They need the support of the global community. So it is of crucial importance to save the life of every single military union, of every single men and women in the uniform of Azov regiment that is right now in Mariupol. So let's pray and let's save those who defend Ukrainian sovereignty in Mariupol.
Right, right. Thank you, Arseniy, for these words. And Applebaum said that there is only one rule. We cannot be afraid. Instead of fear, we should focus on a Ukrainian victory. I thank you all. we should focus on on our common, united European and American victory. Pray for Mariupol, pray for Ukraine. Stand with Ukraine. I thank you. Дуже дякую за вашу участь.
Thank you.
Thank you.